welcome back to the Parable Podcast. I'm Danielle Zapchenk. We are going to hear from Dr. Hannah Stolze today. She is going to talk about wisdom, the beautiful context that is found in Matthew 25, and she shares honestly about her life and her faith that was at a crossroads.
But to land at 22, pregnant, unemployed, living in your parents' basement, on welfare, the whole thing, all of it. And I was a number 5 in my class and future lawyer of Missouri and all the things. And I think a lot of my non-Christian friends thought I was crazy for not having an abortion. And then you're going to be publicly judged. In some circles, you will be labeled as a risky woman.
Here's my conversation with Dr. Hannah Stolze. Today, I am joined by Dr. Hannah Stolze. And Hannah, you are the Associate Professor at Lipscomb University. You are the Executive Director of the Center for Faith and Innovation at Wheaton College. And you're also an author recently of Wisdom-Based Business. Hannah, welcome. Did I miss anything?
No, I don't think so. It's great to be here, Danielle.
So tell us, as a child, where did you grow up? Is this education, being an author, is that something that was of interest to you?
It was really horrible. Actually, going back and looking at it, I took it very seriously. My grandfather gave me an electric typewriter, and I spent a lot of time at the library doing my market research. So I've always wanted to be an author. I've always loved writing. And actually, as a young kid, I didn't dream of growing up and being a logistics professor or a supply chain professor, as you can imagine. My parents were missionaries, and they were missionaries in Iran. And so during the Civil War, of course, they were, they fled. They came back to the U.S. like a lot of Americans did. And so I grew up, I would call it like a post-missionary home, very blue collar America. My dad was a carpenter and a worship pastor, so pretty much a lot like Jesus. And I was always inspired by the work that my parents did, but really thought, well, I'm a writer. I love to argue. Clearly, I should be a lawyer.
Of course.
Of course, right?
Did you have brothers or sisters as well?
I did. I had 2 sisters who are phenomenally musically gifted. So I had to find my own way, in that environment for sure.
So you specialize in global supply chains. For somebody who is not in business, how does that affect the daily consumer?
Well, definitely. I think since 2020, we've heard about supply chain more than ever before in human history. And so when you think about what supply chain is, the very, very simple definition of a supply chain is just 2 or more companies. So usually it's 2 or 3. A lot of supply chains are really massive that coordinate, that work together to move products from raw material all the way to the retail grocery store, Amazon, cart that we shop today. So obviously supply chains they've globalized in the last 20 years. And we definitely felt that and saw that over the last 2, for sure.
All right. Well, Hannah, I'd love to dive in a little bit personally about who you are. And so if you could share with us, what is kind of that parable story that you have today?
Yeah, I am so excited about this. I love that the fact that Jesus used parables to teach. And, I really was kind of an unsuspecting business professor. Just, the course of my life actually landed me. I was in the military. So I enlisted in the Army and spent a few years where I really thought I would go green to gold. And I was going to, do undergrad and then do JAG to get law school paid for. And found myself in really unexpected circumstances right out of my undergrad. Actually found myself as a single mom. And that was I wasn't something obviously that you plan for. And I was in a position of just really soul searching and trying to figure out who I was going to be as a Christian, who I was going to be as a human being. And going into debt for law school seemed less responsible and reasonable. And I had a first sergeant in the Army that found the funding for me to get an MBA. And I had never really considered business as a trajectory for serving God or serving people. And when I start reading Jesus's parables, it is amazing how many of them talk about employees and how we interact with money and even to the product level. How do we share the resources that we have? And there are so many and I know there are lots of parables out there. They're not all Jesus's parables, but I love Jesus's parables. And when he becomes the rabbi and he gets real midrashy, which that's not really a word, but midrash is when a rabbi teaches on a scripture from the Old Testament. And there's one in particular that really has been kind of my core passage, definitely so far this year. And I think a lot of 2021. And it's Matthew 25. And Matthew 25 is actually 3 parables, but I'm just going to focus in on 1.5 of them. And I really think that when Jesus started teaching on Matthew 25, can I tell you a little bit about the context of it? Because it's really amazing. When Jesus teaches this, it's his very last teaching in the book of Matthew. So the next thing that happens in Matthew 26 is he gets betrayed and goes to the cross. So think about this, where it sits. And I would think that your very last teaching is going to be the most important thing. This is the last lesson that you tell your disciples. And he's just come from the temple where he cleaned out, all of the money changers and all, the people that he said that had turned the temple into a den of thieves. And I think that the disciples really thought that when Jesus went into Jerusalem, he was going to go into the temple. He was going to sacrifice a lamb, which is what King David and King Solomon would have done after battle. And then he was going to go in and kick Herod off his throne. And that's really what James and John were arguing about. But instead, he leaves, he goes back out to, the garden overlooking Jerusalem, and he starts teaching them. And there's these three parables. He starts off talking about the foolish and the wise. And if Jesus is talking about the foolish and the wise, we know what book of the Old Testament is all about the foolish and the wise, right?
Yeah.
This is quiz time. Right? It's the book of Proverbs.
Yeah.
Everything in Proverbs is like the foolish do this, the wise do this. And I really think Matthew 25, Jesus is actually teaching from the book of Proverbs. More specifically, I think Jesus is actually teaching from Proverbs 31. When you think about it, he starts off, right? The first parable is about 10 bridesmaids, 5 who are wise and 5 who are foolish. And the wise ones have lamps that burn through the night. So Proverbs 31, this entrepreneurial woman has a lamp that burns through the night. Then we move to the parable of the talents, and he talks about ROI. All throughout Proverbs, it talks about how you sow, how you reap what you sow. And then in Proverbs 31, we see 5 times in 21 verses how profitable her business is. But then we get to the part that really matters. And this is the parable that inspires me, that motivates me. And it's almost questionable. We know it's a parable because he's talking about sheep and goats. And we know that he's not really going to pull, the nations to him. And it's going to literally be sheep and goats. It is people, right? And it's so interesting because the setup of it, he's talked about the wise bridesmaids, and they, I'm a supply chain professor. The ones that were wise had the right supply of oil. And they understood demand. They understood need. And the ones that were foolish didn't have enough supply. They didn't understand resources. And they were foolish. They didn't have enough to make it to the wedding. And the parable of the talents, a lot, we hear about that one a lot. We need an ROI. We need to steward what God's entrusted to us. Great. But we get to the end, and what is it all about? Why do we have resources? Why do we build wealth? Who cares, if we have enough oil or enough food? And it gets really real because Jesus says, I'm going to gather all the nations to me, and I'm going to separate the goats from the sheep. And the sheep will inherit the kingdom of heaven, and the goats I will cast away. And I'm like, oh man, you got my attention. I want to be the ones that inherit the kingdom of heaven. I don't want to be cast away. That sounds horrible. And what differentiates them is they've had enough supply, to meet demand. They've understood how to invest. But when it gets to the end of the chapter, Jesus cares about what we do with our resources. And what he says is, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me water. When I was sick, you took care of me. When I was incarcerated, he doesn't say falsely incarcerated. He says when I was incarcerated, maybe for heinous crimes, I don't know, you came and visited me. And when I needed shelter, you provided me hospitality. And this to me is what motivates me to be a supply chain professor and a business professor, because we have the opportunity in business to figure out how to get products in a financially responsible way to the least of these. And the one thing we saw last year, man, COVID really, really did show us where there are food deserts, where there's healthcare inequity, there's prison problems in our country, where there's, a lack of justice. And I look at all of the good that comes through business that I think Jesus sets up with the bridesmaids and the talents. And I get to the end of the chapter and I'm like, man, I hope we don't build up wealth and forget what it's for, and make a choice to do, the kingdom work of paying attention to people in need around us. So that is my very, very, very favorite parable in all of Scripture. And it's a really weird one, I guess.
Hannah, thank you so much for that context, because I would have to say, when I was a freshman in college, I went to a Christian university and I had my Old Testament class at 8 a.m. and I did not listen as best as I hoped I would now. As a 38-year-old, I'm like, why didn't you not listen? But it's in those details that we see God for, oh my gosh, like who he is. Like he is the ultimate supply chain leader, right? And there's so many details. So I love that you transitioned back to Proverbs 31, because that's so cool. And then also just like that timeline of his life is that it wasn't just kind of thrown out there. There was a specific purpose for what he was called to do, and also what he sees like in our lives as well. So transitioning to yourself, how do you see that play out in your life?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So one of the things that it really inspired me to do, I'm the executive director of the Wheaton Center for Faith and Innovation. And my time at Wheaton allowed me to get a master's of Bible, which was an amazing opportunity. I spent 3 years studying the Word of God, which is so great. But one of the things and it helped me to launch the Center for Faith and Innovation, really having deep theological understanding. And it's really important that I think as Christians, it's tempting to find a verse that window dresses what we want to do. And what I think we need to be doing more of is reflecting on who God is, how we need to relate to him, and what his kingdom actually looks like, so we can partner with the work that Jesus is doing. So that was a start. In 2020, I actually had the opportunity to have Fulbright in Indonesia. And so I moved with my kids like a crazy person. Yeah. To Indonesia. My husband was going to come back and forth. And of course, COVID hit in March and it cut our time short. And when I got back to the States, we had all of these shutdowns. It was pretty shocking to see the inequity of healthcare availability globally, just where ventilators went, where COVID tests went even, not even, we'll leave vaccines out there, just where medical aid went in a global pandemic. And at that time, I got a call from Lipscomb University, and they had a gift to start a supply chain program. For anyone listening, for you, Danielle, we don't choose when we were born. We don't necessarily choose what we're good at. We don't choose the passions that are just bizarrely set inside of us, that I was writing really weird historical books at 10 and praying for China all my life and always wanted to live in Asia. I don't know why. Right? We're just made a certain way. And so over the last 2 years, I started to see a rise in secular academics wanting to do research, wanting to engage in supply chain management in ways that could achieve the UN 30 goals. So when you think about lifting people out of poverty and providing food globally, looking at education, looking at all of the UN 30 goals, in order for them to happen, somewhere along the line, somebody has to manage a supply chain. And I was really struck by that. And so when the opportunity at Lipscomb came, I really had this moment where I said, I don't want to just be a bridesmaid with oil that's ready. I don't want to just be responsible, with making, being a good steward. I really do want to know that my life has had an impact on the least of these. And, sometimes we can do it in our neighborhood. We don't have to get a doctorate and work on the global, do global supply chain and, work towards UN 30, the UN goals. But there is a question that says, well, what has God gifted to me to do? And what can I do that helps the least of these? So when I look at that, I say, okay, I have a degree that means I'm a specialist in meeting demand with supply, or even better, meeting need with supply. And I love it. I think Genesis, at the very end of Genesis, when the story of Joseph, Pharaoh has the dreams, there's going to be a famine, and Joseph interprets, the dreams and says a famine's coming. And so Pharaoh hires him, I guess, sets him in as second in command, and he builds a big warehouse and he stockpiles food. He creates this huge storehouse, and it says that the entire world was saved. So the first picture, a lot of theologians say this is a picture of Jesus, that the whole world is saved, right? John 3:16, Jesus comes. And so I love this as a supply chain professor. The whole world was saved for the first time because of an inventory miracle and a big warehouse. And it was food, right? There were people that were hungry. There was a warehouse that was built. There was an understanding of the supply needed to meet demand over 7 years. And I think, man, sometimes we relegate, really holy and spiritual things to missionaries and pastors. And we forget that scripture is full of people who built warehouses, they built temples, they built all kinds of things. And the Good Samaritan wasn't even a Jew. He wasn't an Israelite, right? He was an outcast who had a little bit extra money, and he cared for somebody that he saw. And so I think whatever we have a little bit extra of, that's what Jesus is telling his disciples. You've got a return on investment. You've stewarded what I've given you. You've grown it. Now, what are you going to do with it? And so I rambled a little bit with that. Sorry, Danielle. But when I think about where does that position me for today, it makes me really excited about saying, how do we create surplus? How do we create margin so that we have, when we meet our own needs, when our bills are paid, what do we have left over for the least of these?
Yeah, gosh, Hannah, that's so true. I think this last couple of years, just recognizing that in my own life, because as Americans, we become very consumed with ourselves. And I think that's just like our sin nature in general. We love ourselves. We're very selfish people. But then just to see what's going on globally, how to love our neighbors well, how to recognize what our words are and how we can help each other. I liked what you said about, you don't have to be like a global supply chain. Like you have to be working in the business world because everybody has these gifts. And how are we going to use them wisely? I think that's so true. It's so helpful and it resonates with each one of us. And I think back to what you were talking about earlier about the Proverbs 31 woman. When you look through Proverbs 31, that woman, you think, oh, wow, she's doing it all by herself. Well, no, she actually had help. And she was, she was going to God, but she also had other people speaking into her life and helping her. Did you have people in your life that were helping you, cheering you on, and also encouraging you?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. Every step of the way. And, sometimes in surprising ways, I think we have opportunities in life where we experience the amazing grace of God through people. And then we have seasons of life where we get to demonstrate the amazing grace of God ourselves to people who don't. But I have had the opportunity of having amazing parents, which I know not everybody has, but it is a huge gift to me. I've also had people who have come around me and seen things in me that I didn't see in myself. And I think this is the importance of being in church and being in community. Maybe not going to a service, fine, on Sunday mornings, but more importantly, having relationships with people who love God and love you. So some of those hard relationships, people who be honest with you and be like, man, you're just not good at that. You need to shift. And so I've had people both that have encouraged me in my career. I've also had people who've come alongside me at different points and invested in me. And I think that the main person for me in particular has been my husband. And I know that's a little bit cliche to say. I tell my students all the time, like, who you decide to marry has a huge impact on what the rest of your life looks like. And when our kids were 4 years old and 10 months old, he left a job he would have retired from, and we moved our family to Tennessee for me to do my doctorate. Like, that's crazy. And it's amazing to have somebody that will champion you and actually, provide resources, right? Like, it was pretty amazing. And so I think, both in my marriage, but also in friends, I've had some really, really amazing, godly men and women who have come alongside me and wanted to invest in ideas and in me personally that have really given me opportunities that I never would have imagined in my life before, for sure.
Way to go to your husband for championing you, because I guess, yes, the answer is cliche, but really, that is such an impact. And it's also such a beautiful example because not everyone has that kind of relationship with their husband, a person who encourages them and says, yes, go get your education. And then also, what an example to your daughter. I'm sorry, do you have daughters or a son?
I have one of each. Yep.
One of each. So it's an example to both of your children saying, like, this is how a relationship should be as we are encouraging one another. And then that just translates into every relationship. So that's so beautiful. Going back to when you said you were in the military, you were a single mom. How did you feel like God was with you? Because that was a weird transition of your life. Like, was he speaking to you? Were you feeling like, where are you right now?
Such a great question. Such a formative season of my life, obviously, because we know the end result, right? I chose God. I chose to keep the faith, to persevere. And there is nothing, I guess I'll use the word humbling, and humbling in the sense of maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't be humbling, but being single and pregnant is one of the most interesting, I'll say, experiences in humanity. I really did walk away from God. I really struggled with my faith in college, some based on experience and some based on my own arrogance and ignorance of who God really was and the point of it all. But, I had always thought, I was always academic, but to land at 22, pregnant, unemployed, living in your parents' basement, on welfare, the whole thing, all of it. And, I was, number 5 in my class and future lawyer of Missouri and all the things. And when I said that before about, opportunities to experience grace and to demonstrate it, that was really that season. And I think a lot of my non-Christian friends thought I was crazy for not having an abortion because it is life-changing. It's going to change the trajectory of, I really had a job in China that I couldn't take. And then you're going to be publicly judged for 9 months. And then if you keep your child for the rest of your life, in some ways in the church. And, really in some circles, you will be labeled as a risky woman for the rest of your life. And so I had been in like some kind of quasi church leadership in the churches I was in college, and then moved home to my parents' churches. So I got to go through like pretty public church discipline in both places. And I had this one moment. I'll remember it forever because it really shaped both who I am and I think who my son is as well. And I was sitting in my parents' basement, just like crying out to God, like, God, I don't think I'll ever have anything to offer at this point. Like, I don't even know how I could break even. Like, I can barely find a job where you can pay for food and rent and a phone and groceries and childcare. Childcare is so expensive and so overwhelming. I feel like that was one of the times in my life where, you have those moments where like God speaks. And it was the first time that I really felt overwhelmed by the love of God. And I realized how amazing his love was and how undeserved it is. And how no point, even in our most, our highest achievements or our lowest low, his love remains immeasurable and undeserved. So it is not one of those, we earned it, or, he loves us because, we did something great. He loves us because he created us and he loves us. And I also felt like he spoke to me in that season that my son would never be without a father. And the churches that we were in, for whatever reason, decided as a board of elders that children should be raised by a father and mother, and that was God's design. And if I wanted my child to be raised as God intended, I should give him up for adoption. And I did not have a peace about it. I had a college degree. I was working in the Army at the time, and I just didn't have a peace about it. And this is where, I said I had amazing parents. Thank God my parents aren't yes people, because they really stood beside me. And it was so amazing. The first time I went out with like church people as a single mom, in that season, I did have guys in the church say like, I would never marry someone like you. I'm going to marry a virgin. I'm going to marry a woman, all of these things. And you're like, well, can't fake that one.
Yep. It's an immaculate conception. I promise.
Right. And so, you do have this thing where people counsel you and said, it's better for you to give this child up because, nobody will ever want to marry you or take on, this child. And so the first time I go out with this group of church people, all of this is weighing down on you. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'll be a pariah for life. I met my husband that day. And my son was 4 months old. And my son is half Black, and my husband had done a lot of medical missions in Haiti. He actually asked God, I would love to have a dark-skinned child. And we met. I told my son that he fell in love with him first. But we started dating that year, and he was there for my son's first Christmas, my son's first birthday. And after we got married and he adopted my son, his name is on his birth certificate. And that moment where you're like, man, God intercepted my life. And in a moment where maybe I was the least of these, maybe I really was. I mean, I was definitely on welfare. I was trying to find work. I definitely had opportunity to be kind of cast out of all of the circles that I would have navigated in, both in my, professional world as well as in the church world. And I look at the kindness of my husband who, did fall in love with me, did fall in love with my son. And that is the kingdom of heaven. That is the hope of the cross, that we were already not enough. And Jesus is more than enough for us. And gosh, doesn't that inspire you? Like when you get to the end of Matthew 25, you're like, yeah, I want to work hard. I want to get lots of stuff to give it away so that when somebody around me is in need, when there is demand, that I have something to put there. Like if the Good Samaritan hadn't had a donkey and hadn't had oil and hadn't had coins, that guy might have died by the side of the road. And there's something in that just, it changes who you are for the rest of your life.
Hannah, thank you so much for being honest about that and choosing to share that, because I think I was one of those people who grew up in the church, and you just have these ideas. And I think that as you age, certain things start connecting the dots and you realize, is that what I really believe? Because I would say that about, we just did an episode with my husband, and I had this list of, okay, I don't want to marry a man who's divorced. I want a virgin, somebody who is like a full-blown Christian. He like is passionate for Christ, and basically no one that sins. So
you need Jesus.
Yes.
Jesus,
so,
me.
And then like, you just feel like that pressing on your heart. God's like, that you are a sinful person as well. You are broken, and I still love you. And so when we meet people, when we start hearing their stories, when we're in that community with one another, we kind of break down those walls, because I don't think Jesus came and just like, here's all the rules. I want relationship with you. And so when we are in relationship with each other, that's when we can see the kingdom of God, and we can see what his plan is, and we can love and give grace. And so that is an amazing story story, and how beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, of course.
Let's transition. So you wrote a book called Wisdom-Based Business, and it came out in 2021. Were you writing that in the pandemic, or had you already finished your book before 2020 happened?
Yeah, no, my deadline was May of 2020. So for sure procrastinated and wrote it during the shutdown.
Would you say, like, why wisdom? Like, how did that become so important to you that you felt that you needed to write a whole book on wisdom-based business?
Wisdom in the ancient times, and I won't go like way heady, okay? But wisdom in Proverbs 1-9 was introduced as a woman, right? Lady Wisdom. She shows up. She's in the streets. She's crying out. She always has employees. She always has servants that are working for her and doing work. And then we get to the end of the book of Proverbs, and we get to this passage of Proverbs 31, 10-31. As my sweet Wheaton students would say, it's the checklist for the hot Christian housewife. And we get to this passage, and if you read it the way I had been taught it in the church, it reads that way. But what we don't take into context is the anomalies of that 21 verse passage that actually is a standalone chapter in the Hebrew Bible. So King Lemuel's mother's, the first 9 verses in the Hebrew Bible actually come earlier in Proverbs. They're not in the same chapter. And I think by putting them together, it confuses what's happening in those last 21 verses, because it opens with the Eset Chayel, and it actually just means the valiant woman. And the word Chayel, it's got to be one of my favorite words in the Old Testament because of like my military background, but also being a woman. It's not used a ton of times in the Hebrew text. It's used to describe David's mighty men. So the word excellent that we see in the noble woman, right, is also mighty for David's mighty men. And then it's used in the book of Ruth. And in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth actually follows Proverbs. So because it's believed that in Proverbs 31, we have 2 key terms, the term for Hayel, which is valiant, excellence, noble, and then the term Hesed, which is, the Micah 6:8, this is the mercy word, the loving kindness, the steadfast love. And those 2 terms show up in every chapter in Ruth as well. So the term valiant shows up when it talks about Boaz being a mighty man. And it shows up in talking about Ruth and Ruth's character and the character of God. So I love this. Like, this is amazing. We have warriors. We have wealth. We have an immigrant woman who sacrifices everything to gather resources for her mother-in-law. And then we have this Proverbs 31 woman. What is this really talking about? So if we read the book of Proverbs like a bracket, like it starts out with the Lady Wisdom and it finishes with 21 verses about Lady Wisdom again, this excellent woman. Proverbs 31, 10-21 is an acrostic. It's an A to Z. And I think it's an A to Z of Lady Wisdom personified. And when you think about it that way, Lady Wisdom isn't a priest. Lady Wisdom isn't a king like David or Solomon. Lady Wisdom is a woman. She happens to be a mother. She happens to be a wife. She happens to be an entrepreneur. She happens to be a boss and an employer. She happens to be a customer, and she happens to be a supplier. And the fact that she's out in the marketplace buying flax means that she has scale in her business beyond her own household. There is no doubting this woman is buying and selling in the marketplace. It says 5 times in 21 verses, she's profitable. Her lamp doesn't go out at night. You hear me going back to Matthew 25, right? And with the excess of what she makes, she reaches out her hands to the poor and the needy. And Proverbs 31, 10-21 is the most holistic, succinct business plan in all of Scripture. I had to write about it.
Yeah. What would you say for somebody who either is in business, who is one of your current students, or a mom that is at home in the throes of childhood? What would you say? How do you kind of cultivate that wisdom? How do you utilize that and put that into your day-to-day life?
I always joked about that passage and said, I'll be just like her when I have a bunch of servants.
Yeah.
I think we've all felt that way. But when you shift it and you actually look at it as somebody who understands who they are, they understand the family that they're given to serve, they understand the employees. I love it in that passage. It says that her whole household, which would include all of her employees, don't fear for the future. So her employees aren't worried about seasonality. They're not worried about getting laid off. They're not worried about not being able to provide food for their own homes. It's a really beautiful picture when you think about whether you're running a business or you have the opportunity and the privilege to step out of the workforce and serve at home, which is way more work than being in the workforce, let's be honest, that God has entrusted us with oil that we can burn. I mean, if I can keep going back to Matthew 25, I hope that's okay.
Do it.
He's entrusted all of us, whether it's, she was up planning out the tasks and setting out roles for her employees, for her servant girls. If you think about that, it's so cool. It's like leadership development 101. So whether we are doing that, whether we're up, creating curriculum to teach our kids, whether we're up, thinking about the next product that we're going to move into the market, this passage speaks to everybody that wants to be wise and says, are you going to put in the long hours? Proverbs is all about that work ethic and putting in the long hours and investing. And the reason we do it, we need to be profitable. We need to steward what we have. But the reason we do it isn't for profit. That's boring. Don't stop at profit in business. That's super boring. The reason we do it is because of the end of the chapter. It's because of the end of Matthew 25 and really the central verse in Proverbs 31 that says she reaches with the excess of her business. She reaches out her hands to the poor and the needy. And the poor and the needy are around us every day, whether they're emotionally needy, whether they're poor in spirit, whether people are physically poor. We do not have to look far in our social network to say, what do I have excess of? Because I kept my lamp burning through the night, because I invested a little bit more so I could have a little bit more to give. And you know what? Sometimes we are on that. We have the big margin and we're the Boaz in the story. And sometimes we're the one that's in need and we're the Ruth. And I think the opportunity in that is, I love that we get Ruth and we don't just get Boaz, because we see the opportunity to be faithful and wise and godly, whether we're the one with lots to give or we're the ones that are gleaning, impoverished in the fields of those who got up late so that they would have access for us.
Hannah, thank you so much for really giving us that context and just teaching me today. I can't wait to go back through Proverbs 31 right now.
I know. It makes you want to read it again.
Yeah. And just that's so cool, because I think when we see those details and when somebody helps us just share those little bits to encourage us and see the truth and the worth of the Bible for us, and God left it there for us. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for helping us better understand wisdom and really how that coordinates back to Matthew 25. I appreciate it. If people wanted to connect with you, learn more about you, how can they do that?
Yeah, I have a website that is Hannah J. Stolze, and a landing page for wisdom-based business. So either of those places, you can connect with me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn if you're businessy.
Okay, great.
I'm pretty easy to find.
Thank you again for sharing your heart. That personal story about you and your son and where you were, as a single mom being pregnant. I mean, I'm going to remember that. So thank you for sharing that and just being honest. And I can obviously see the passion in what you have and what you're continuing to do. And thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danielle. It was really fun talking with you.
I so appreciated Hannah's passion and just the way she taught. She taught me today for sure. And I appreciate her sharing that context and background of the Bible and how all of these details, they come together and they showcase God orchestrating it all together. It is so beautiful. Some takeaway questions to think about or journal this week and just to reflect about what we learned today is, number one, what is one area you are seeking wisdom in? And how are you going to bring that to God and possibly others you trust this week for help? Number two, now that you have this context and perspective from Hannah, I want you to go ahead and reread Proverbs 31 or Matthew 25 and just kind of look to see what stands out to you now. What is God trying to teach you this week? Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to talk with you and get to know who is out there listening to the show. You can follow me over on Instagram or Facebook. There's extra content over there about behind the scenes of the podcast and our family, resources that are helping me grow and learn. And I'd love to talk with you. So you can find me hanging out on Instagram or Facebook. That is at Danielle Zapchenk. That is Zapchenk. If you have any questions, you want more information about today's episode with Hannah, all of the show notes are available at daniellezapchenk.com. That is going to do it for today. Thank you so much for spending time with me. Truly, I'm so grateful. Remember though, your parable, it showcases the supply chain of your life, right? So just go ahead and use it. You guys have so many gifts. I'm cheering you on. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.